Welcome to The Writing Monkey, a podcast for writers about everything but writing. Subject matter experts and unique individuals are interviewed for writers by a writer.
In this episode of The Writing Monkey, we're going to talk guns and ammo with Joel Persinger. Joel Persinger is the co-founder and chief operating officer of KBTN Incorporated and host of GunGuyTV, a YouTube channel. He is an NRA certified law enforcement firearms instructor and has taught thousands of people how to shoot. He has also worked on a fugitive recovery team as a bounty hunter. I want to start by saying that this episode is not about Second Amendment rights, gun control, or politics. I'm not out to trash any books or movies. I don't think a writer should be expected to be a gun expert, but it is my belief that authors should avoid glaring errors that could undermine their credibility. You need to write what is appropriate for your audience. In a romance novel, a pistol can simply be a pistol, but it wouldn't hurt to make sure you know the basics. How are you doing? I wanted to thank you for being on the show.
I'm doing well. It's a crazy busy time at work, and I did an interview earlier this morning with the California Rifle and Pistol Association, so it's just been kind of crazy. But other than that, no, I'm doing very well. I'm grateful to be busy. That's a good problem to have, and business is busy, and God loves me, my wife loves me, my kids love me. Every once in a while, somebody that actually likes me.
I like you, and I appreciate your patience getting on the air with me doing this interview.
My pleasure. I'm grateful that, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm grateful to be on with you.
So as you know, this podcast is about educating writers on weapons and weapon use and that kind of thing. And I wanted to start with just personal observation. There seems to be a big fear factor for many people who've never fired a weapon before, kind of like jumping into cold water. They'll hesitate, and sometimes they can't even pull the trigger. They fear the kickback or the unknown. Have you witnessed that before in your training?
I have. I don't witness it a lot, but I've seen that. I think it's a combination of things. One would be the impression people get about guns from TV and movies and that kind of stuff. But I think part of it too is just some trepidation about having something in your hand that's going to go bang and make a big noise. A lot of it's noise. I mean, it depends on, you'll also see a difference depending on which range you're at. If you're at an indoor range where it's kind of like a concrete bunker, then there's not only the noise, there's the pressure change in the room. So you can actually feel the pressure change when the gun goes bang, because there's it's a little mini explosion, if you will, going on inside the gun. So it's not a huge pressure change, but it's something that you can feel. And then, of course, inside a concrete bunker, it's louder. And if there's people shooting around you, it's louder. If you're on an outdoor range, then you have less of that because you don't have that confined space in which to feel the pressure change. So you really don't feel that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then you also don't have the echo chamber that you're in either. So people tend to seem to have less of a problem initially shooting on outdoor ranges than they do on indoor ranges in my experience.
That's interesting. I would have never known that. I wanted to first talk about the general terminology of guns and weapons, and maybe explain to the audience the basics between a pistol and a revolver, a long gun, a rifle, a machine gun, a shotgun. There's a lot of different basics I don't think a lot of authors even understand. They use them interchangeably and erroneously in many cases.
Okay, which one do you want me to cover first?
Let's talk about your standard guns nowadays, your standard pistols, rifles, revolvers, that kind of thing. Just an overview.
Sure. Well, in general, handguns are amongst handguns, there are various different types of handguns, and it's really based upon the way in which they function mechanically. So, for example, you have a revolver as opposed to a semi-auto pistol, which is where you get pistol and revolver from. A pistol generally refers to a gun that is semi-automatic, and it has certain parts that move differently than the parts that would move in a revolver. And we're gun people, so we just call stuff what it looks like or what it does. So, for example, in a revolver, you have a cylinder, and the cylinder, it contains the ammunition. It's called a cylinder because it's a cylinder. It's cylindrical. And every time you press the trigger, the cylinder rotates or revolves, which is why the gun is called a revolver, and it simply moves whatever cartridge you just fired out of what we would call out of batteries, out of the way because it's empty, and it replaces it with one that puts in battery. So when the hammer falls, which, by the way, is called a hammer because it looks like a hammer, it strikes something, or it looks like a nail, it's called a firing pin. When the hammer falls, it fires that round, and then when you press the trigger again, it rotates the spent one out of the way, it revolves out of the way, and puts another one in its path, and that's why it's called a revolver, because a cylinder revolves. And generally, they have ammunition for
Right.
5, 6 to 7 rounds. A semi-automatic pistol, on the other hand, functions differently. It has a slide, and it has a magazine, typically, and essentially the slide moves back and forth, forward and back, and all it's doing is ejecting the spent cartridge and then stripping a new one off the top of the magazine and feeding it into the back of the barrel. But the bottom line is that it's simply a different mechanical approach to achieving the same thing.
Yeah, pistols are generally spring-loaded in the clips. You have to push them down into the clip, and the spring pushes them back up.
Well,
right?
There's a difference between, now you're talking about terminology, there is a difference between a clip and a magazine, if you want to get technical about it. A magazine has
Right.
a spring and a follower, and ammunition is contained in a magazine, and the spring pushes up the little device underneath the ammunition called a follower, and it keeps pushing up on it until it's all used up. A clip, on the other hand, is just a piece of metal or plastic. It can be made out of a lot of different things. And what it does is it contains the ammunition so that it can be easily and quickly fed into a magazine. But the two are not necessarily interchangeable. Okay. A magazine typically has a spring and a follower, and it contains ammunition so the gun will fire. A clip is just something that's used to organize the ammunition so that it can be fed into a magazine and loaded into a magazine efficiently.
I want to let my listeners know, in case they're having trouble visualizing this, I am going to have links, show notes on the your episode page, so they can go and look at different examples of this, pictures and illustrations of these kind of things. Yeah, I've learned a lot. I thought I knew my stuff, but I learned a lot just preparing for this interview. Like I said in the introduction, this is not about gun rights or politics. I don't believe authors should be gun experts or gun nuts, but even a romance author who mentions a pistol should just be aware of what a pistol is, how much it weighs, what it can and can't do, just to add a little more authenticity to their writing. Glaring errors sometimes will ruin a book for some people. So that's interesting. So how does I wanted to stay away from politics, but there has been a lot of talk about AR-15s and automatic and assault weapons.
Sure.
Can you discuss that a little, just kind of bring us up to speed on what an assault weapon is and what an automatic or semi-automatic weapon is?
Sure. Well, an assault rifle is one thing. An assault weapon is a political term. So the term assault weapon does not apply to any particular firearm. It's a political term only. It really isn't a technical term associated with a firearm.
Okay.
An assault rifle, on the other hand, does refer to a specific type of firearm. And they are essentially a mid-caliber, or it's not a big heavy caliber, and it's not a pistol caliber. It's a mid-caliber rifle caliber that's easy to shoot because it doesn't have a lot of recoil and it's easy to handle, and it has what's called a select fire ability. In other words, it will fire semi-automatic. You can press the trigger, and each time you press the trigger, it'll fire one round, or it can fire fully automatic, which means when you hold the trigger down, it fires like a machine gun. And that's what's called an assault rifle. Now, some of them also have a selection in the middle. So you might be able to fire semi-automatic, depending on where the selector is, which you press the trigger and one round fires. You might be able to fire it fully automatic. You press the trigger and hold it, and it keeps shooting until you let go of the trigger or it runs out of ammunition. Or there might be a burst section. So some of them might have a 3-round burst selection. So you put it on 3-round burst, and every time you press the trigger, it'll fire 3 rounds and stop. That's an assault rifle. And there are specific rifles in military use around the world that do those things. An AR-15 is none of those things. It is a semi-automatic civilian look-alike, basically, of a military firearm, which is the M16, or in a shorter version, the M4, but it's essentially the same gun. And an M16, a military M16 or a military M4, is an assault rifle in the sense that it has those options on how you can use it, whether it'll fire fully automatic or a 3-round burst or semi-automatic. Those options are part of those rifles. But an AR-15 doesn't do any of that. All it fires is semi-automatic. It's essentially just a civilian look-alike version of what the military assault rifle would be. And then politically, we've called it people have named it an assault weapon for political purposes. But the term assault weapon, people should understand, really doesn't apply to anything. It's just a political term. Assault rifle, on the other hand, is a real term, and it applies to a specific category of firearms like the ones I described.
So obviously there's a lot more here than we could cover in even 2 or 3 hours just talking about that. But I did want people to know there's a lot of differences and subtleties between machine guns and submachine guns and rifles, and pistols and revolvers and handguns. And like I said, I'll have show notes so people can educate themselves on that to some degree. I wanted to move into some of the aspects of gunplay that I think people in Hollywood totally leave out. And one of them you've mentioned earlier is the concussion and the volume of a gunshot. And most television and movies I've seen ignore acoustic trauma unless it's a bomb going off in World War II, and then there's the ringing of the ears and that kind of thing. But a gunshot is incredibly loud. And I have some notes about the decibels of different things that we experience in everyday life. 60 decibels is a typical conversation. 100 decibels would be listening to your music with your headphones all the way up, and that could cause permanent damage after 15 minutes. So I wanted to know if you had any thoughts about it in context of movies and books. I'd love to hear your observations there. But do you have any thoughts about the hearing damage, the gun volume, the concussion, that kind of thing with a gunshot?
In the context of entertainment, from an entertainment perspective, I don't know how that plays into a particular story. I think it would, as you're a novelist, it would depend on what the novelist was trying to create. But certainly I think having the knowledge that firearms can be and are generally very, very loud might change the way you might have a character behave when the gun goes up, bang.
Right.
It might change the response of that character. For example, you see, and just to give you some examples, you see movies or television shows, or you read a book where there's a big gunfight. The cops have run into the good guys, run into the bad guys. They're having a gunfight, and everybody can magically hear just fine in the midst of all of that. They can talk to each other at a normal tone. They can tell each other what to do at a normal conversational level, and so on. And that just doesn't equate to reality, because everything is so incredibly loud and your ears are ringing. And, if you've ever experienced your ears ringing because of a loud noise, it's difficult to hear through that sound. It's worse than having tinnitus in one area, where you've got that constant ringing. And so in an environment like that, it's really a shouting match to be heard, and everybody's shouting at each other because you have to shout over the damage that's done to the ears and over the incredible cacophony of noise that's happening as guns are going off all over the place. I would say in a less dramatic setting where you have a police officer or an individual who is defending themselves, or a criminal, somebody that's fired 1 or 2 rounds of ammunition because they're in a fight or they're doing somebody in, you've got some sort of antagonist and they're murdering somebody in your book or whatever the case might be, then sure, if they're in it, particularly if they're in an enclosed space, inside a car, inside a house, inside a building, or in an alleyway, for example, where it's concrete buildings on either side of you, yeah, that's incredibly loud. And everybody and the grandmother is going to hear that go off in the neighborhood, because it's going to reverberate all over the place, even if you're around concrete buildings. And if you are the person who's standing there when the gun goes bang, or you're the individual who made it go bang, your hearing is going to be seriously degraded for at least hours, if not a day or two. And then every time your ears ring, most professionals or doctors will tell you you've done some level of damage to your hearing. As a testimony to that, I wear hearing aids to this day because I've been carrying a gun for, almost 30 years, and I've been around them. I'm an old guy. I can't call the 50s my own anymore. And so I've spent a lot of time on ranges and shooting and hunting and like that. And we didn't use hearing protection when I was a kid. So as a result, it can damage your hearing for sure. But in an entertainment context, I think it might just be interesting, depending on what you're doing with the story that you're writing, to keep that in mind in case that might change the scene or change the context a little bit.
Yeah, those are some good points. It is incredibly loud, and my mind is going in 100 different directions thinking about hearing and hearing loss. And I used to play music as a teenager really loud, or go to a concert or a dance, and your ears would ring afterwards, and you thought it was funny, and then your hearing would come back, or you thought it did, but it probably didn't come back all the way. And I've just been reading up a lot about hearing damage, intense ringing, all the damage. So that's one thing you mentioned is when you're shooting off of guns in an enclosed concrete bunker space like a rifle range, how incredibly loud that is. You didn't mention the type of hearing protection you might be wearing. And typically you wear plugs and muffs, right? Ear muffs and earplugs.
I don't, and if you're smart, you do, yes. So I just think I just called myself a dummy. But I typically don't, and the reason I don't is because I have significant hearing loss already. I wear electronic hearing because I need to be able to hear what my students say, and I need to be able to hear what the questions that they're asking me and that kind of stuff on the range. So the electronic stuff I wear, will allow me to hear the conversation, and then it shuts off at the time when a gun goes off.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it provides excellent protection, but yeah, if you're there just shooting on your own and you don't have to have a conversation with someone anytime you're on the range, it's far better for you to double up on hearing protection, because even with earplugs, there's leakage around the exterior of the ear. So some of that sound is still getting in your ear canal through your bone structure and everything else. So you want those muffs over the top of your ear. And then when you put on shooting glasses, there's some leakage around the muffs where the shooting glasses are penetrating, where the muffs are sitting on top of the shooting glasses. So you want to have the plugs on as well. You'll feel like it's the most silence you've heard in a while, particularly if you've got kids or whatever. I'm not so sure that's a bad thing, but it will protect your hearing quite a bit better. It's super important to use hearing protection anytime you're shooting, because otherwise you'll do yourself a lot of damage. If you don't mind my interjecting something here, you talked about pistols versus revolvers. From a story writer's perspective, sometimes they have the bad guy or they have the spy or whatever, and he's got a suppressor, which the public calls a silencer.
That's the very next thing I was going to talk about. There is no such thing as a silencer. They're actually called suppressors. They reduce the sound of a gunshot by about 35 decibels, from what I could ascertain in my research. And they're also designed to suppress the muzzle flash, which is something we haven't talked about. But the whisper quiet guns in the movies are really fiction unless you're shooting a subsonic, really a low-speed ammunition with a very big suppressor on the end of your gun.
That is exactly correct, and that's why they're actually technically called suppressors, not silencers. They're not terribly dissimilar in function from the muffler on your car. They reduce the sound a lot, but you can still hear the engine running. And with guns, that's the same way. And you mentioned something, if it's a round that travels faster than the speed of sound, not only is there the sound of the actual gun going off and the little explosion going off of the gun, there's also the sound of the bullet breaking the sound barrier. And that cannot be suppressed. So once the bullet leaves the end of the gun, leaves the muzzle, when it breaks the sound barrier, you get a sonic crack. And that can do your ears quite a bit of damage as well. The thing about suppressors is kind of interesting is that it also depends on the kind of gun you attach them to. So, for example, sometimes in stories and movies and TV shows, people will have a suppressor on a revolver, which really doesn't do very much. It does a little bit, but in the way revolvers function, you have the cylinder, and then you have the back of the barrel, and the part of the back of the barrel that's a little wider than the rest of the barrel. It's like a funnel, so that the bullet will find its way in there correctly, and it squishes it down. It's called a forcing cone. But anyway, there's a little gap between the end of the cylinder and the end of the barrel, and the bullet has to jump that little gap. Well, when it jumps that little gap, there's a lot of gases and noise that come out between the cylinder and the barrel. So if you put a suppressor on the end, all it does is force more of those gases and noise out of that gap. So it really doesn't suppress the gun very well at all, and it's still very loud. And yet you'll see them in the movies with the revolver, and it just makes a tiny little sound, and that just doesn't work. The same can be true, only differently from a semi-automatic handgun's perspective, is you have the top of the gun called the slide, which slides back and forth. And obviously, I said we're gun people. We're not very smart. We just call it what it says or what it looks like or what it does. And that's why it's called a slide, because it slides. It slides back, and it throws out the spent brass, and then it strips a new round off the top and feeds into the back of the barrel. Well, when it does that, a lot of that sound is released out of that ejection port on the top of the slide. So if you have a suppressor on the front, you press the trigger, you're still going to hear the clatter of the slide, and you're still going to hear a little bit of the explosion when the slide opens up and separates the spent piece of brass from the back of the barrel.
Right.
So in every case, you're going to have noise. Sometimes that noise, even with the suppressor, is sufficient to do you some harm with your hearing. Sometimes it's not. But in every case, it's not silenced in the way that Hollywood would make you think it would be. It simply reduces the sound, as you said, significantly. It doesn't make it go away.
They sometimes show Navy SEALs or these special operations guys using what looks like a rifle, but instead of a barrel, it's got a giant thick suppressor that may be 2 feet long on it. And those are... They portray those as making a clicking sound. Do you know how accurate that is, or how quiet those can get?
They do two things. They reduce the sound of the gun significantly, and they reduce the muzzle flash out of the front of the gun. but I've never shot a rifle with a great big suppressor on the end, so I can't tell you how much they suppress it. I can tell you what they're supposed to do and the reason why they're used, but other than that, I couldn't speak to the volume reduction.
I'm not sure how accurate it is, but I have read that they did move over a few decades ago to subsonic ammunition because most of what they do is close-up battle, and they rely on stealth. So they have shifted over to large suppressors and subsonic ammunition.
This is what made 300 Blackout interesting. 300 Blackout. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but 300 Blackout is a type of ammunition. It's a caliber of ammunition that was built to fire out of using the same rifle and just a different barrel, same magazine, same type of rifle as an M16, but they changed the upper part of the barrel out. They changed the barrel out and the upper part of the receiver out. Now you have a 30 caliber bullet instead of a 22 caliber bullet, but it's subsonic. And they use those with suppressors because since the bullet is bigger, it hits harder, it does more damage, it is more lethal, if you want to put it that way. And at the same time, because it's subsonic, it doesn't have to move quite as fast to get the same job done. And special operators like that can use a round like that. So that was actually an experiment that was done. 300 Blackout has become very popular in civilian circles now for that same reason. But and I don't know that the military is using that particular round anymore, but I do know that the military has experimented with those things, just as you said, because they want to make sure that they're keeping things as quiet as possible because, these little teams of special operators, they really got their fannies hanging out in the wind a lot because there's not a lot of, they're in there, they're on their own.
Right.
Tough to get them back out again sometimes.
So I wanted to talk about the penetration of a round. Like we often see people hiding behind car doors for protection, which may work if the shooter can't see you so they don't have a target, but they don't really offer much protection. It's a thin sheet of metal. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the penetration of various bullets.
In firearms training parlance, if you want to call it that, there is something called cover and something called concealment. And they're two different things. Concealment is something you can hide behind that will hide you from view, but it won't stop or deflect an incoming round. It won't provide you any protection from bullets or gunfire. Cover, on the other hand, is something that you can hide behind and it will conceal you from view, but it will, at the same time, potentially provide you some level of protection, maybe complete protection, maybe partial protection, but it will stop or deflect incoming ammunition. Obviously, rifle rounds are much more powerful than handgun rounds. So what will protect you from a handgun bullet may not protect you from a rifle bullet. And that's why police officers can wear light body armor that's made of Kevlar or some other material that will protect them from pistol rounds, but it won't necessarily protect them from rifle rounds. Different guns penetrate different ways, but I mean, you're looking at, if you want to be protected if you're driving your car, for example, the only part of your car that will protect you from an incoming bullet is the engine compartment because the engine's in there. That's why you'll see police officers when they pull up, and it's one officer in a car, if they pull up behind someone that they are concerned is violent, they'll tend to angle that car away a little bit so that they can open up their door and work in the V of the door, so that in front of them is the engine compartment between them and that car they've just stopped, and they'll turn the tires sideways so that down near the ground, the wheel well is turned in such a way that the brake pads and the steel wheel and all those things are protecting them underneath in case a round skips under the car so it doesn't hit them in the ankle and destroy their ankle. Then the next thing you know, the poor officer's on their fanny and their gun's gone skipping across the street because they got hit in the ankle and they've lost their mobility. So they'll tend to park strategically to protect themselves.
Oh, that's interesting.
You'll find that in your house or in an office building, there's very little cover. There's a lot of concealment. But very few things, unless they're really heavy and they're made out of really strong material, they're going to stop rifle rounds. And honestly, very few things will stop pistol rounds either unless they're very heavy. So your couch, your refrigerator, those kind of things, the walls in your house, those are not going to stop bullets.
Interesting. But they will reduce the impact of the bullet.
Yeah, not sufficiently to protect you if you're on the other side of it. It doesn't go right through and get you. It might deflect it and change it a different way. But when you see the movies where they turn the tabletop over and hide behind the tabletop, no, it doesn't work. You're going to get shot right through the tabletop. Or when they hide behind the door, they hide behind the wall, and somehow they hide behind the exterior of the wall of the house, and as long as they're not standing in front of the window, they don't get shot. No, it's going to go right through the wall. I mean, if you think about the construction of a wall, it's just studs 16 inches apart, drywall on the inside, maybe a little insulation stuck on the outside. That's not going to stop a bullet.
Yeah, you can put a pencil through drywall.
Right.
In one movie, I saw him shooting a 50 caliber rifle through cinder block walls.
Yeah.
Ricochet and debris, that's kind of related. A lot of times, I think people overlook the damage and the dangers and the likelihood of getting hit with ricocheted bullets or debris flying up. You know, like in the movies, they often shoot off the lock, and that always makes me cringe because I just picture that bullet slamming into the guy's hip or shards of metal going in their eyes, and I was just wondering how dangerous shooting like that is in your experience.
Well, are we talking about bullets that are ricocheting because somebody's shooting at you and they're ricocheting off objects, or are we talking about you shooting at objects and they ricochet and come back?
Well, a little of everything, but if you're standing 2 feet from a metal lock and you shoot at it, what's going to happen?
It depends on what you use to shoot at it. There are shotgun rounds designed specifically to breach doors, and they'll be used to knock a doorknob off or destroy a deadbolt or break a lock. And those shotgun rounds are specific to that purpose solely so that they don't have any material that would spray back on the officer or the military member's body and cause them any damage. And generally those shotguns that are used as breaching tools have an extension on the end of the barrel that's used to make sure that the barrel is not placed too close to the object that you're trying to destroy. It actually gives you a few inches of distance, so when you put it up against that object, it's got an established distance that gun needs to be away from that. Absent that, if you're using buckshot or slugs or whatever, and you're shooting something heavy, made of heavy metal, there's a very significant chance that you're going to get splatter or you're going to get something coming back at you that's going to cause you damage. Like I said, for breaching, you're breaching doors, there are specific rounds designed specifically for that tool. And frankly, they're not good for much of anything else, but they do that really, really well. And most of the breaching guns have a breaching extension on the end of them.
Yeah, you're talking about guys trained to do it who have face shields on and gloves. I'm talking about some idiot with a 9mm who points it at a padlock and pulls the trigger.
He's probably going to get a 9mm stuck in him somewhere.
Yep, that's what every time they do that, I just look at it and think, and the lock is probably not going to come off anyway, and you're going to end up with a slug in your leg. I don't know, that's always bothered me.
Well, leg or abdomen or something. Yeah, probably so.
I've had the fortune of being able to fire different weapons in different environments, and I just wanted to talk about the recoil of weapons and keep getting back into what it's like physically to shoot a weapon, because so many people have not done it who are writers, and unless you've done it, it's really hard to understand it and write about it and come up with words to describe the explosion and the muzzle flash and the sound and the concussion. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on recoil. I know that's kind of a nebulous term, but they often don't portray that accurately in media.
The actors don't pretend that it's happening. You know, they're shooting a blank that doesn't have any recoil, or they're shooting what's called a squib.
Right.
By the way, a squib in Hollywood is different than a squib on the range. It's the same term for two different things, so if you want to know what they are, I'm happy to say it. But they're shooting something that doesn't have any recoil, so the actor or actress have to simulate the recoil, otherwise it looks like there isn't any, because there isn't any. But yeah, I mean, depending on if you're shooting anything that would be considered a caliber that law enforcement would use, or military would use, or a deer hunter, or somebody hunting medium-sized or large game, or a civilian for self-defense purposes would use, that's all going to be fairly large in the sense that it's going to be big enough to get the job done, which means you're going to have recoil. Obviously, if you're shooting a .22 or a little gun like that, they don't have much recoil. So when you're shooting a 50 caliber Barrett, you can be outside in the boonies, and not only will the recoil, make you a little goofy, but also you probably felt it at the time. I mentioned that if you're in an inside area, you have the pressure change of the gun going off. You can really feel that inside a bunker or inside an indoor range. But I'll tell you, shooting a Barrett or something like that, you feel that outside. I mean, even outside, you can still feel it. And if you're the spotter next to the guy when it goes off, you really get a blast of it. And you feel that pressure going off. It's impressive.
It's exactly
exciting and somewhat terrifying all at the same time. So I understand what you went through. But yeah, recoil is something you get used to if you shoot a lot. If you don't shoot a lot and you're new to shooting, it can sometimes be terrifying because you're not prepared for it. And then if you're new to shooting, oftentimes new shooters who aren't prepared for it tend to not shoot very accurately because they anticipate it coming, and as a result, they'll jerk the gun off target in preparation for the gun going bang. And so it's hard for us sometimes to get them to just let the guy go off and realize that it's not going to hurt you when it does. So recoil, I think you've said it very accurately, Luke. And unless you've done it, it's very hard to describe, and it's very hard to write about. I've had a number of authors over the years who have come and taken, brief courses with me just to get the experience of shooting and understand how it works and do exactly as you've described. And precisely for the reason that they weren't writing a book about guns per se, and actually that wasn't even a main part of the story. It just so happened that somewhere in the story there was a firearm involved, and they wanted to make sure they understood it well enough to at least not, look silly in the process of including that in the story, and I thought that was very wise.
That's one thing I love about writing, actually, is doing that type of research, talking to all these different people, experiencing different things. I decided I need to start sharing this with other writers, because I think I see that as a big lack in a lot of writing, when they start writing and immediately they hit things they just have never experienced, and they either try to fake it or they ignore it. And both of those, to me, are bad approaches. I actually went down into the sewers and walked through the sewer grates for about 30 yards just to get that experience of what it's like. And because until I did it, I didn't know the smell and the feeling. It's a whole different feeling when you're underground in a little dark, wet tube.
It's absolutely impossible to describe if you haven't the experiential data with which to describe it. And I think that applies to anything and everything. The other risk that you take, I think, if you fake it till you make it, is that the minute somebody picks up the story and starts reading it or watches the TV show or the play or the movie, and what you've done is so grossly inaccurate because you didn't know that it is offensive to them, then you've got somebody that, you've got a whole group of people, whether it's physicians or nurses or law enforcement people or whatever the subject matter may be, that really didn't enjoy the story as much as they otherwise might have had you taken the time to do a little bit of research into that particular subject, whatever it is.
Yeah.
That's from the perspective of a guy who reads books and watches movies and TV shows. I've never written any of these things, so I can't speak to it from the position that you can.
Well, most people I've talked to just have a great capacity to suspend disbelief, meaning, I've interviewed a guy like you, expert in weapons, but you're willing to overlook some of the errors because it's drama, it's writing, it's movies, it's TV. But there's just a point where it becomes so ludicrous, it's best to avoid that if you're the writer. And I guess that's my goal. One more note on recoil. Actually, you can go on YouTube. I do find it a little helpful to look at some of the videos of people shooting various weapons, and you can see the recoil effect of real weapons, whether it's a .22 or a shotgun. And you can even see some idiots firing their weapons and hit them in the head and knock them out and that kind of thing.
Every time I see that stuff, or every time I see some guy trick his girlfriend or wife into shooting a great big gun in a way that doesn't work so they can laugh at her afterwards, that drives me nuts too, because that's just not right.
Makes me angry because it's so dangerous, but it does give you a good idea of how strong the kickback some of these guns have. So I wanted to ask you about scopes. Do you have any experience with them?
Sure.
In one forum I read that in one show, a character was using a rifle with a scope indoors, and he compared that to trying to use a pair of binoculars to watch a fly buzzing around a room. The magnification makes it nearly impossible to find the target up close. Do you have any thoughts on scopes, magnification, that kind of thing?
Well, when I was a boy, which was back when we wrote things on, stone tablets with chisels, and I'm kind of old. When I was a boy, a scope was a scope, and you had iron sights and a scope, so that's what you had. Now you have a broader category of things called optics. You've got iron sights, which are just made out of metal or plastic, and those are the standard things that come on rifles and handguns and so on. And then you've got optics, and optics give you a range of choices. Some optics fall into the telescopic scope or telescope category, in which there's magnification. And yes, if you're trying to use those close up, that's not what they're designed to do. And you're right. It's like it's like using a pair of binoculars looking for a fly in your bathroom. You're not going to find it. On the other hand, there are optics which are designed specifically to be used close up, and they don't have any magnification at all, but they do provide a very simple way to aim the rifle or shotgun or whatever. And you'll see those in military use, law enforcement use, by security contractors and so on. So when you look at for example, an M4 carbine used in the military, a lot of times they have iron sights, but they also have one kind of blob in the middle right on the top. And that generally is a tube or a square-shaped thing. And that's an optic, and all it is a zero magnification optic. And it has a red dot in it. It's a red dot optic, or it has a little holographic sight in it. But it's basically meant to be able to very quickly get on target and press the trigger and hit what you're shooting at. And those work really well in low light and almost complete darkness, as long as you can see what you're shooting at. And close quarters, they work great. But if you're using a telescopic sight, which is the long version of scope, telescope, then yeah, I mean, that's not a close-up thing. That's something you're using at some distance. Now, there are some that, by the way, that are variable power type telescopes where you can turn it all the way down to 1 magnification and all the way up to 9 or 10 or whatever, and you can turn the little knob, and it'll change how much it magnifies. And those, sure, yeah, if you set them all the way back to 1, you can use those close up, and then you dial them up to 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever they go to, or somewhere in the middle, depending on the distance that you're using them.
Interesting. And what about laser sights? Are those commonly used? Are those accurate? You know, we see that a lot, the red dot.
Yeah, they're commonly used, but not in the way that you would think. Lasers are commonly used by civilians. They're commonly used by military. They're commonly used by law enforcement, but they're used differently by each. So, for example, I carry a gun every day, and I have a set of laser sights from a company that makes them that are actually part of the grips on the gun that I carry. And so if I draw the firearm, my grip squeezes on a little button automatically, and the laser comes on. And that's used for specific types of shooting. So let's say, for example, an instance in which a civilian might use a laser. If you're in a confined building, you're in a meeting, or you're in a place where maybe you're out in a parking garage, and now somebody's trying to hurt you, and you've found a place to hide, or you've found a place where you've got some of that cover that's protecting you, you don't want to stick your head or body around the corner to be able to point the firearm at the bad guy and actually get on target. But what you can do is you can peek around the corner enough to be able to see, and then stick your hand around the corner and put the laser dot on them, and when you press the trigger, you're on target. So they're used sometimes for that in a civilian context. Sometimes it's folks are old, or it's night and you can't see the sights, and you're scared and you want to be able to put the dot on the guy and press the trigger. Bang. Now here's where they're not used. They are used by military as laser designators. If they have what's called an IR laser, it's an infrared laser that you can't see unless you have the right optical equipment on your head, so the naked eye can't see it. And, the soldier or Marine or sailor might use that to indicate which group of people are the good guys, which are the bad guys, who's going to take on which guy, and that kind of stuff, because the enemy cannot see the fact that they're using it like a pointer, like you would use a little laser pointer in a presentation, or they're just pointing at where they saw people that they're concerned about. They use it as a designator like that. Sometimes in very close quarters they'll use it, but a lot of times they just use what they call reflexive shooting, and we could talk about that if you'd like. But sometimes they'll use it at close quarters if they're clearing a building, but most times not. It's just more times used for what I just described. I have never seen a laser used as a sniper tool, and yet that's done in movies and books and TV shows constantly, where you've got the guy that's 300 yards away, and he's using the laser to lock onto his target that he's trying to shoot at. And by virtue of seeing the laser, they know they dive out of the way, and then the bullet comes and it misses them or whatever. It's not a sniper tool. A laser is generally used as a real close-up and personal, point it and shoot type tool to get the gun on target without having to see the sights because you don't have time, or to shoot around, to reach over the top of something and still be able to get it on, because you don't want to risk putting your head up there, or as a designator to point things out at a distance. But as far as a sniper tool, it's not used for that.
I've read that they do that to scare people away, to break them up, because they see that red dot and they think there's a gun pointed at them, so they run off.
Oh, that could be true. I've never heard of anybody actually doing that, but I suppose it certainly would. If you've watched enough television and seen little red dots go on people and know what follows on the TV show, then that would get me to move. I wouldn't be standing there.
Yeah, me too. And I'm not sure if that's accurate or legal. It was just one of the forum things that I read. I just thought it was an interesting tactic that they've used to break up crowds.
Yeah, I can't imagine law enforcement using it. I mean, military may. Can you imagine how that would come back on a law enforcement agency if people thought that police were pointing guns at them to get them to break them up? I'm not sure that would work in a law enforcement context or in any kind of civilian context, but it might work in a military context. I don't know. Yeah,
you're right. But I was reading a lot about overwatches in Afghanistan and things like that. That's probably what I read. Did you have some thoughts on the accuracy and the range of pistols? I know sometimes we see in the movies, like in Lethal Weapon, he shot a helicopter out of the air with a handgun from like 100 yards, and it was just ludicrous because I don't think it could be done.
First of all, hitting a moving aircraft with a rifle or handgun or shotgun, not a simple proposition, not very easy. I mean, it's not, the likelihood of you actually doing it and doing it reliably is pretty small. But no, look, you get into the difference between the effectiveness of the actual cartridge, in other words, how far will the bullet travel, and will it do any damage if it hits something, and the actual ability to reliably and accurately hit a specific target at any given distance. And the two things are dramatically different. I mean, for example, when I was a kid, my dad, who was a deputy sheriff, was walking down the street, and a kid about 2 miles away was shooting at birds with his .22, and the bullet went up and traveled about 2 miles and hit my dad in his lower back, right above his right hip. Didn't kill him or cause him any serious damage. He went to the hospital, and they never took it out. In fact, my dad used to joke about never getting the lead out of his butt for the rest of his life. But it's, the effectiveness of that round, in the sense that it traveled 2 miles and actually broke the skin and stayed inside of his body for the ensuing 30 years, is one thing. The ability to actually hit anybody 2 miles away is a whole different conversation. Right. And that's the case with handguns as well. I would say that the average, even the above average pistol shooter can accurately and consistently hit targets out to 50 yards. Most times, most people can, if they practice, they can do it to 25 yards. I can solidly hit targets all day long at 50 yards with a handgun. It depends on the handgun. Give me a little bitty one, maybe not so much. 100 yards, yeah, I've met guys who can do it, and there are guys who can do it, and there are ladies who can do it, but they're pretty rare. And I do know that in some military circles, some of the military guys actually practice that, and they're very, very good at it because their training is specific to that from the standpoint that they're in a war zone, and if their rifle breaks, all they have is their sidearm, and if the enemy's 100 yards away, you better be able to hit them. Yeah. And they can do it, but the average cop or the average, criminal or the average civilian or even the average soldier, sailor, Air Force member or Marine is not going to be able to do that with a handgun. It's an extraordinary skill, and only a rare group of people can actually do that.
100 yards, you said? About 300 feet?
Yeah, it's a length of a football field. I know that there are guys who can do it. I have a friend who's actually attended some of that training who has done it. Not as well as the guys who do it, but he has done it with a 9mm. I've never attempted it. The farthest I've ever shot with a handgun accurately was 50 yards. And yeah, I can keep all the rounds in a decent sized group at 50 yards standing with a handgun. But that's half a football field, and that's more than most people on the planet with a handgun would be able to do. What do they say? Don't try this at home. I'm what they call an expert.
That's amazing. So yeah, I wish I had more information on that, because that's one thing I think is misrepresented grossly, is the range of bullets. And the damage too. I mean, bullets can be deadly on one hand, and then you can have guys who can get shot with like 5 or 6 different bullets and still keep going, depending on where they're hit and what kind of round hits them.
Well, it depends. I mean, in the movies, you hit the guy in the fingernail and he goes flying through the wall, and it just doesn't work that way. Right. Handguns in particular are terrible guns to fight with. Yeah. Because they're not nearly so lethal as a rifle or a shotgun would be. And largely because, and I'm talking about, larger type guns that are center fire guns, not 22s, but talking about handguns. Handguns are simply used so much by law enforcement and so on because they're small and you can put them on your hip and carry them with you, and they're handy to have around, but they're not necessarily the best gun to fight with. In fact, the old joke among law enforcement when they used to have just nothing but shotguns in the car was that the handgun, the sidearm, but to get them to the car so they could get to the shotgun. And a lot of military members will tell you that their sidearm is for no other purpose than to get them to their rifle. It's because they understand that long gun, that shotgun or that rifle, is a lot more effective than that little short one.
Makes me think about the weight of ammunition too, and how people will load up on ammunition in the movies, or they'll mysteriously produce a lot of ammunition, but you add all that up, it gets pretty heavy. There's no way you're going to lug that stuff around easily.
Yeah, that's the reason why the military went from .308 and .30-06 to .556, which is what they shoot now out of the M4. In World War II, the primary fighting rifle for the United States military was the M1 Garand. I know everybody calls it a Garand, but John Garand pronounced his name Garand, so in deference to him, I'll pronounce it the way he pronounces it. But the M1 Garand was the main fighting rifle, and in addition to the Springfield 1903 bolt-action rifle, and they shot .30-06, which is a great big honking thing. And you can, one guy, you can only carry so much of that around. It's heavy.
Yeah.
And then they went to lighter and lighter bullets primarily because it allowed the soldiers to be able to carry more ammunition. It's lighter. The gun itself is lighter. You know, every bit of, I've heard many a veteran say and this is their quote, not mine, every little bit of battle rattle has to have a purpose because it starts weighing them down and they have to move with it.
Now, I just read recently they're experimenting with cartridgeless bullets. So when they explode in the barrel acts like what the brass would normally have done, which was to confine the explosion. So there's no brass left behind, and it reduces the amount of material used and the weight that they have to carry.
Right.
So we're getting really close to the end here. I was wondering if you had any last thoughts on weapon etiquette or safety, any things you've observed in basic handling, beginner mistakes, or Hollywood blunders, things like that?
If you don't mind just a comment on the Hollywood blunders, and it's not to pick on Hollywood by any stretch of the imagination, Hollywood is the entertainment industry, just as novelists are part of the entertainment industry. Their goal is to entertain us, and I think in many respects also to comment on things going on in our society that bear somebody's comment, honestly. And that's not new to Hollywood. People have been doing that with theater and so on for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's part of the role. But at the same time, certain things that are used in Hollywood or used in books and novels are dangerous pieces of equipment if they're not handled properly. And I will tell you that it's very common for me to have students who do not understand that Hollywood and novels are not part of the education ministry. They're part of the education business. They're part of the entertainment business. Does that make sense? And so as a result, they think that it's okay to handle that firearm the way it's handled in the movies or on TV or the way they saw their favorite character in a movie or in a book handle it. So I think to some degree, and I think to a limited degree, but I think to some degree it is incumbent upon novelists and screenwriters and so on to research those items which could harm people if used improperly, and make sure that in their stories they at least know enough to make certain that they're not accidentally and unintentionally educating people when they mean to entertain them. And if they're going to educate them, let's educate them properly.
I agree with that. Yeah, the whole intention of my podcast isn't to make everything completely realistic, but mostly it's to help writers become more credible, have more food for thought, more creativity, to aid in their creative writing. But one of my missions is to help educate people, if I can, the kinds of things you're talking about, misinformation that can be dangerous.
Frankly, as a consumer of entertainment stuff, I don't want it to be 100% realistic.
Right.
Who wants that?
Yeah, it's boring.
I got to deal with that all day. If I wanted realism, I wouldn't go to the movies, right? Or I wouldn't read the book. So
Exactly.
It doesn't need to be we don't want to do that. That takes away the entertainment value for certain. I'm just saying that you kind of want to be careful that you're not teaching people to do things that might actually emulate, and then you would wish they did. They wish they didn't.
I think you've answered all my questions. We've discussed all the topics that I wanted to go over as a writer, and I really appreciate all of your time and your input.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure, Luke. Anytime.
All right. Thank you so much, Joel. I'll talk to you later.
All right, sure. Have a wonderful day and be safe.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Writing Monkey Podcast. Be sure to visit us online to access our comprehensive show notes and bonus content. Until next time, write, you monkey.